this video, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, and we're going to look at how that autonomic nervous system is divided up. There's a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system, and it's basically about our stress response. So the sympathetic nervous system, we also call it our fight or flight response, and parasympathetic, we call it our rest and digest response. We think of our sympathetic response as our stress response. So what kinds of things does our brain determine as stress? Right? So the most common things are emotional stress and exercise. We have acute stress and we have chronic stress. So the autonomic nervous system deals mostly with short-term or acute stress. We can have long-term stress, and we call that chronic stress. And in that situation, we're not going to use the autonomic nervous system as much. We have a hormone called cortisol, and that's part of the endocrine system, and that is more involved in long-term chronic stress. So emotional stress and exercise are the most predominant factors that trigger the autonomic sympathetic nervous system stress response. But other things can trigger it too, like having low blood sugar, low oxygen levels, being very cold, and pain. Pain will trigger an autonomic response. So if you have an injury, you hurt yourself, okay, that will also trigger the autonomic response. Emotional stress is subjective. So your previous experiences will affect how you perceive new environments. Okay, let's look at an example. Going on a roller coaster. Two people get on a roller coaster. One of them is having a great time and is feeling excitement, whereas another person is going to perceive that roller coaster ride as extremely stressful, and they're going to have a major sympathetic nervous system response, and they're primarily going to make epinephrine. So perceptions of our environment impact how the nervous system is going to respond. Now, before we look at the specific effects of what is happening during a sympathetic response and a parasympathetic response, I want to look at the neuron structure. Okay, so first I want to remind you about the somatic system. So we're going to look at how a motor impulse leaves the spinal cord and goes to a skeletal muscle that we voluntarily control. And then we're going to compare that to what the neuron system looks like in the autonomic nervous system. So in this diagram, we can see we have a cross-section of a spinal cord. And remember from a previous video how we talked about sensory information moves in through the dorsal side. The dorsal root ganglia contain the sensory cell bodies, and the sensory information goes in the dorsal side. The motor information, the cell bodies, are in the ventral horn. So the cell body of the motor neuron starts in the spinal cord, and that motor neuron goes out to the spinal nerve, and then one single neuron is going to go all the way down to the effector. In this case, it's going to be skeletal muscle that we can voluntarily control. One neuron from the central nervous system to the effector, and we can voluntarily control it. The target is skeletal muscles, and the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is always excitatory, and it will always cause muscle contraction. Now, if we compare that to the autonomic nervous system, we have a sympathetic and a parasympathetic response. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. And now, the sympathetic actually has two ways of functioning. One of them is going to involve the adrenal gland. So the differences between the somatic system and the autonomic system. Let's first look at the sympathetic system. Here we have our cross-section of our spinal cord. The cell bodies are in the lateral horn. The neuron leaves through the ventral root and goes through a spinal nerve. And then there's going to be a synapse. There are two neurons when we look at the autonomic nervous system. So we have ganglia. This is where there's going to be a lot of cell bodies grouped together in the peripheral nervous system. So we have a pre-ganglionic neuron and a post-ganglionic neuron. When we have this first synapse, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And when the postsynaptic neuron reaches the target tissue, the neurotransmitter is now different. Now we are going to release norepinephrine. Norepinephrine will bind to receptors, and now the target tissue is also different. The target tissue is going to be anything that we cannot voluntarily control. So smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The other thing that is different is that depending on what receptors this neurotransmitter binds to, it can either be excitatory or inhibitory. So we can have multiple effects. So when we have our somatic system and we're going to contract our muscles, we are always going to release acetylcholine. It's always going to be excitatory and it always causes contraction. If we want to inhibit a muscle, that has to happen in our brain. With the autonomic nervous system, there are different receptors that norepinephrine can bind to that will either, say, dilate a blood vessel or constrict a blood vessel, and is going to depend on the tissue. We will look at all of the different tissues and how the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system affect them. So now if we look at the parasympathetic neurons, we can see there's also two neurons. There's a presynaptic and a postsynaptic, but now there's a couple of differences. So again, autonomic nervous system cell bodies are in the lateral horn. There is a pre-ganglionic and a post-ganglionic neuron. The first neurotransmitter is also acetylcholine. And the second neuron will release acetylcholine, not norepinephrine. So the neurotransmitter that's released from the post-ganglionic neuron in the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic is different. The target tissues are the same, but the effect is going to be different because the neurotransmitter is different. Now the last thing here I want to look at is what happens when the sympathetic pre-ganglionic neuron innervates the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is located on top of your kidneys, and there is an outer region called the cortex and an inner region called the medulla. So the adrenal medulla is what is innervated by the sympathetic pre-ganglionic neuron. When the sympathetic pre-ganglionic neuron synapses with the adrenal medulla, it is going to release acetylcholine. So the first synapse is always acetylcholine. When acetylcholine binds to the adrenal gland in the adrenal medulla, it is going to cause the medulla to release a hormone. And it's called a hormone because it's going into the bloodstream. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are the exact same molecule if they're released from a neuron or if they're released from the adrenal medulla. The only difference is that when it synapses and binds to another neuron or a muscle or the heart, then we call it a neurotransmitter, but when it's released from the blood, then we call it a hormone. So the adrenal medulla is going to release a combination of epinephrine and norepinephrine. About 80% will be epinephrine, about 20% will be norepinephrine. So primarily epinephrine is released from the adrenal gland. Acetylcholine is released from the post-ganglionic parasympathetic neuron, and norepinephrine is released from the post-ganglionic sympathetic neuron. And here is a summary chart. When we compare the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, sometimes we call the sympathetic nervous system the thoracolumbar system because of where those sympathetic pre-ganglionic neurons originate. When we look at our entire spinal cord, it's the thoracic and lumbar regions where the sympathetic nervous system neurons originate. Whereas the parasympathetic neurons, they originate in the brainstem and the sacral region. So we can call the parasympathetic nervous system the craniosacral system. So now what I want to do is I want to just go through the different regions of the body and look at what are the effects of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. In this diagram, we're going to look at how the sympathetic nervous system, what kind of effects it has on different body parts on this side, and the parasympathetic is over here on this side. Before I zoom in and start looking at the different tissues, I want to point out where the ganglia are. So there's a pre and a post ganglionic neuron for both of these systems. When we look at the sympathetic nervous system, these neurons are in the thoracic lumbar region. They originate in the lateral horns of the thoracic and lumbar sections of the spinal cord. And when the pre-ganglionic neuron leaves the central nervous system, the ganglia are very close to the central nervous system. So the pre-ganglionic neuron in the sympathetic nervous system is very short. And then the post-ganglionic neuron in the dotted lines here will be very long neurons that are going to go to the target tissues. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, the cell bodies originate in the brainstem and the sacral region, and the pre-ganglionic neuron is very, very long. The ganglia are very close to the target tissue compared to the sympathetic nervous system. So let's zoom in and see what's happening with each of our tissues. First, we will look at the pupils. What happens to our vision when we have a stress response? We are going to dilate the pupils, and our vision is going to be more suited for far vision. Whereas the parasympathetic, think about resting and digesting, the pupils are going to constrict, and we will be more suited for near vision, for like reading. The salivary glands. We use saliva for digesting food. So when we have a stress response, we're going to inhibit that because we are not digesting food. The sympathetic system will inhibit. So you can sometimes think about if you've had a stress response and your mouth gets really dry. Whereas when you're having a parasympathetic response, you're going to stimulate salivation. Next, we'll look at the heart. When we have a stress response, we're going to need to increase our cardiac output so that we get enough oxygen going to the tissues during our stress response. So the heart rate is going to increase and the force of contraction is going to increase. During a rest and digest parasympathetic response, the heart rate is going to slow down. Our airways. When we have a stress response, we need to increase the amount of oxygen so that we can make more energy. So the airways are going to relax, which means they're going to dilate so that we can breathe. We will also increase our respiration rate. Think about when you exercise, you need to have more oxygen, so your breathing rate is going to increase. Whereas with a parasympathetic response, the airways are going to constrict. Not constrict to the point where you can't breathe, but they're going to be less dilated than when you have a stress response. Okay, blood vessels. I want to point out blood vessels here because blood vessels are going to constrict or dilate in different parts of the body. Think about the areas of the body that are going to need to have more blood flow. They're going to need to have more nutrients like glucose and oxygen so that ATP can be produced. So blood flow is going to increase in tissues like the heart and the lungs and the skeletal muscles, whereas it's going to constrict in areas related to digestion. Our sweat glands are going to be stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. For some of these tissues, there is not an opposite parasympathetic response. So most of the time, your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system responses are opposing. So if the sympathetic makes your heart rate go up, parasympathetic will make it go down. But not every tissue has a parasympathetic response. If we look at our digestive organs, The parasympathetic, our rest and digest, is going to stimulate digestion. So it's going to stimulate secretions like digestive enzymes and mucus and hydrochloric acid. And it's going to stimulate muscle contractions, smooth muscle contractions, so that you can digest your food. It will stimulate the pancreas to release digestive enzymes and insulin. Remember that insulin is a hormone that tells the body to take nutrients and store them. Insulin tells us to store fat and glycogen. So when we are eating food, we're increasing the amount of nutrients that we're taking in, so then we store them for later. When we have a sympathetic response, a stress response, now we're going to inhibit the release of digestive enzymes and smooth muscle contractions. And we're going to stimulate glucose production by breaking down the stored fat. There are a few processes the liver goes through when it is trying to increase blood sugar. So it can break down glycogen, called glycogenolysis, and it can break down fat, called lipolysis, and it can sometimes make glucose out of other nutrients like fat molecules or amino acids, and that's called gluconeogenesis. So those processes will be increased when we have a sympathetic response because we're breaking down stored nutrients to increase blood sugar so that we can increase energy production. In the digestive tract, the sympathetic nervous system is going to inhibit muscle contractions or motility, and it will inhibit secretions. So we're not going to release digestive enzymes. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate intestinal motility and secretions so that we can digest and absorb food. With the kidneys, the adrenal gland will be stimulated during a sympathetic response, and the adrenal gland itself will make epinephrine that will contribute to all of these processes. And the kidneys will increase the production of a molecule called renin. The kidneys don't just function to get rid of waste products. The kidneys play a really important role in regulating blood pressure. So when we produce renin, that is a molecule that's going to stimulate some other chemical reactions that causes the production of another hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone causes the kidneys to reabsorb water and ions. So when we reabsorb water and ions, we're keeping it in the body instead of peeing it out. So that means our blood pressure will increase. So when we have a stress response, we're going to increase blood pressure because we need more blood pressure to be able to pump all that glucose and oxygen to the tissues. So with the bladder, when you have a parasympathetic response, this is going to stimulate the bladder to contract, which means you are going to urinate. So urinating is primarily stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system response can make you feel like you need to pee more because you're increasing your blood pressure. When you have higher blood pressure, that stimulates urination. But the sympathetic nervous system doesn't cause the bladder to contract and make you urinate. Okay, so we need the parasympathetic nervous system for urination. And then lastly, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic work together in the reproductive tract of males. So the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest, is required for blood vessels to dilate to cause an erection, but the sympathetic nervous system is what actually stimulates ejaculation. So there needs to be a nice balance between those two systems for this whole process to occur. So when you are looking at the functions of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, just think about what do you require for a stress response. Okay, think about an emotional stress or exercise or pain. What does your body have to do? Your body needs energy, and so you have to increase blood sugar, which means you're going to break down stored nutrients. And you're going to increase heart rate and cardiac output and respiratory rate to get the oxygen so that you can make ATP. And you are going to inhibit digestion. When you're trying to fight or run from something, you don't have the energy to digest food. We can't have both of those systems working at 100% at the same time. So you can have a small stress response and you can eat some food and that will probably work. But if you eat a big meal and then you try to go exercise, it's not going to work. You're not going to have the energy to put into the skeletal muscles for a workout if you've just eaten food and your body is trying to deal with digesting. You'd be better off working out fasting, but if you're starving and it's later in the day, have something small. Okay, only have a small meal that's very easy to digest so that your body doesn't have to put a lot of energy into the digestive tract when you're trying to exercise. And I've summarized all of those functions in 2 charts.